So the housing market is back in the news again. There are reports that economists are seeing 2008 numbers once again. But the big story here is Gen Z and millennials, and this is something that we've been focusing on. I just want to share this here. This article that was published by Fortune magazine said that Gen Z and millennials can't afford to buy a house, and it shows. The number of first-time home buyers is half the historical norm. So this is a big one here that we've been focusing on. I went through the home buying process during the pandemic. I know how stressful it can be. And I've often told my audience that if it wasn't for those really low interest rates during that time and help from my parents, I don't know if I would have been able to do it. I definitely don't think I would be able to do it today. What is happening here? Should people be concerned? Are we seeing '08 numbers again?
Yes, I think the short answer to your very important question is yes. We are in a very serious economic decline. And we live in a country that is going through that, but is responding to it, if I can borrow a term from psychology, by what we call denial, by a massive pretense that something which is admittedly bad news and is scary, we make it go away by pretending it's not there. It is something we notice in children, and you're supposed to outgrow that kind of tendency. I remember when my little daughter first encountered a scary dog. She was about 3, and the dog was barking, and it was near us. So she put her little fingers in front of her eyes and felt much better because she couldn't see the dog. And in her little 3-year-old mind, if she couldn't see it, it wasn't there. You know, and if you're 3, that's okay, right? You're learning, you're growing up. But by the time you're 6 or 7, you figured out that whether your hands are there or not, the dog is the dog, and he's still there. We're a nation that's becoming childish a little bit. Let me explain. Home prices for first-time home buyers make a house unaffordable. The prices have gone crazy. On the one hand, the price of the home. On the second hand, the price of borrowing a mortgage, which is how most people buy homes if they're able to do it. The same is true of rents. They're at all-time highs. And in no way have the wages and salaries of the vast majority of Americans kept up with the prices of housing. So you've got a very classic situation that you are pricing a majority of the people out of the possibility of owning their own home or even of renting adequate space. That's why we have these strange other numbers which show that a dangerous level of people's income having to go to pay for housing. If they're renting, for example, leaving insufficient money for all the rest of the things you need in life above and beyond where you live. And let's remember that number that first-time home buyers are less able to afford a home today. It was not this bad unless you go back to 1995, which is 30 years ago. I want to remind people, over those 30 years, the population of this country has gone up, meaning that there would be more first-time home buyers in a successful economy would be seeing more because more people are in that situation. Instead, we see less over these 30 years. That tells you something that can only be summarized in this way. One of the basic ways you judge an economy, any economy, is how well does it provide the basics, the basics, food, clothing, and shelter. And the reality is, as your data in the clip you just showed us illustrates, is we live in an economy which is failing to provide adequate housing for millions and millions of its people. And yeah, they're not all wandering around the streets homeless, although we have a serious homeless problem in this country. But what they are doing is living in crowded circumstances that are not of their choosing. You don't have to be an advanced degree holder in psychology to know that if too many of us are living too close together, even if we're in the same family, or maybe because of it, we get on each other's nerves. In other words, it has serious consequences if you don't give people proper housing. It is a very serious sign. Now, my last point. There is an area where housing is being produced in record amounts around the country. But it's housing that we call high-end housing. It's the housing that's expensive. It's the housing that is built, to be blunt, for rich people who can afford to pay 7% mortgage, who can afford to pay elevated rents or buy expensive homes. And we know the numbers. 20% of our people, 20, have enough money to be in that area where they can buy homes and they can trade up if they have the opportunity. But for 80% of our people, the overwhelming majority, this is an economic system now that is failing to provide food, clothing, and shelter, or at least the shelter part of it. And there is no sign, none, that this situation is going to get much better anytime soon.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Another thing that we see happening, in particular here in the Boston area, Massachusetts, is that more younger people are leaving the city and moving out to the suburbs where it's more affordable to rent, or they're moving to other states. There was an article that was published here last year encouraging young college students, college graduates, to leave Massachusetts and to move to Michigan if they want to buy a home. The only concern that I have with that is that if people start to flood Michigan, wouldn't the cost of living start to increase in Michigan as well? I feel like that's a temporary solution to tell people to move to these more affordable states or states that are cheaper. You also have to have jobs available in those states for everybody as well.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. That is not a solution. What that is an attempt to distract people from the problem by giving them this quickie idea, oh, why don't you go to where housing is cheaper? You know, my answer to that is, why don't we get the employers of this country to pay us the appropriate wages and salaries? Then we wouldn't have to yank our family out of Massachusetts and go 1,000 miles west to a Michigan, which has serious unemployment problems that you correctly point to, that has serious problems because when you have an economic decline, the way Michigan has, for example, because the automobile industry is no longer dominated by the United States. And all of those tariffs that you hear Mr. Trump talk about every day are not going to bring car business back to this country. General Motors now sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. And General Motors knows its future is China, not the United States. And they've made the adjustment. Americans may still like to demonize China or to say bad things about it, but I can assure you the business community is eager to please the Chinese so they have access to what is the fastest and biggest growing market in the world, which is not the United States. Going to Michigan, therefore, no one's going to do that. The jobs aren't going to come back. And yeah, you can get a cheaper home, no question about it. By the way, that's true for the whole Midwest. That's true from Minnesota and Wisconsin in the north, all the way down, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, all of those places, housing is cheaper. But here's the important insight you just gave us. It's cheaper for a reason. Nobody is buying housing there. Their economies are in such trouble that the people trying to sell a house have to bring it down because there's no buyers. To tell Massachusetts people to go to Michigan is telling them, go because the housing is cheaper, and please don't pay attention to why that's the case, because if you do, you'll discover you're being asked to move to a part of the country where the economic situation is considerably worse than it is in Massachusetts. The per capita income of Massachusetts is much higher than that in the Midwest. In other words, it's a better functioning economy, and it's really a cheap shot on people to tell them that if the economy is failing, it's your job to take the enormous risk. I've been through several movings. I'm married, I have a wife, I have 2 children. I know what it does to a family to move. I know what it does to an individual. That's one of the biggest traumatic events of a lifetime. You will remember your moves better than you remember many other things in your own life. Don't tell people to move if the economic system isn't delivering what it should. Put your critical thinking on and try to make the economy better. Change it so it does deliver what it ought to deliver. That's the message that these statistics, I think, ought to convey to people who confront them.
And speaking of wages, there has been a big push over the years for a $15 minimum wage. But then I was introduced to this report called Out of Reach. Now, this report is published every year in July, and they actually show what you need to make in each state to afford a 2-bedroom rental. One of the things I found very not so shocking, of course, is California is number 1. They have the highest housing wage. According to the Out of Reach report, they say that you need to make $49.61 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental. And if you're working minimum wage or paid minimum wage, you have to work 120 hours a week to afford a 2-bedroom rental. And a lot of people look at this map and they say, well, it's mainly the blue states, but then you see Florida, and this is what I talked about with the influx of people moving from states like Massachusetts to Florida. Florida has become more expensive over time. They're now the 9th highest housing wage. But the point is that the $15 minimum wage at this point, I don't think, according to the Out of Reach report, isn't enough for people to live off of. Based on or adjusting for inflation, what would you say the minimum wage should be in 2025?
Well, you're talking to a person who takes all of this very, very, very seriously. I mean, a $15 minimum wage is being condemned to live a life of serious economic problems haunting you every day of your life. You cannot eat, drink, wear appropriate clothing, live in a decent home on $15 an hour. And by the way, I invite you to go to any state in the union and ask around, find the people that are living on $15 an hour, and then ask them if they would be so kind as to tell you what they had for breakfast, show you the outfits they wear, show you the apartment or the house where they live, and the conditions. And you would know right away, it wouldn't take you very long at all, that you don't want to live in those conditions. You don't want to have a family in those conditions. You don't want to live in the neighborhoods where people earning that kind of money live. And we kind of all know that. And yet we want to pretend that because there are employers who pay, and this is the truth, lower than that. I want to remind everyone that the federal government has, and has had for almost a century now, a federal minimum wage. It was passed in 1938 by the United States Congress and the President Roosevelt at that time. Today, that federal minimum wage, and believe me, I'm just a messenger, I didn't cause what I'm about to tell you, is $7.25 per hour. That's right. One of the lowest minimum wages in the world exists in one of the richest countries in the world, which tells you more than anything I can otherwise tell you. The richest country in the world has one of the lowest minimum wages. When was the last time the minimum wage was raised at the federal level? Answer, 2009. Okay, here we are, 15 years and counting. Over those 15 years, prices went up in America every year, sometimes only 1 or 2%, sometimes 9 or 10%. But in every one of those 15 years, as the cost of everything went up, what we paid the minimum wage stayed the same. We were savage to the poorest among us. I don't know what kind of religion or morals or ethics you all take seriously, but if they're anything like those I think we're supposed to have in our minds, there is no excuse for what we do in this country. That's why, by the way, half the states of the Union, half of them, have higher minimum wages passed by law in those states than the federal government does. For example, there are, I don't know the last time I counted, I would say there are 6, 7, 8 states who already have minimum wages above $15 an hour in order to begin to recognize the truth of what I'm saying, which is it is outrageous. It ought to be at least twice that. Maybe if we start at $30 an hour, we could address the 15 years of an unchanged federal minimum wage. By the way, are there states in this country where they observe the $7.25? Yes, they are. And if you wanted to draw a map of the states where Mr. Trump is the most popular, and then the states where the minimum wage is the lowest, you'll discover that in general, it's the same states. It's an amazing situation that, again, has no justification. Of course, those people can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment unless they're sharing it with 3 other families, which is what millions of people do. It is.
That's right.
It is a scandal. I mean, there's no polite word for me to use. I mean, I don't want to embarrass you or anybody watching or listening, but the truth of it is a scandal. It's an immoral way of treating our fellow citizens. By the way, it has nothing to do with immigrants. If anything, the immigrant condition is even worse, which is why punishing the immigrants by deporting them and having those ICE people do their horrible behavior on these poor people makes you shake your head. What is the country coming to?
It's really interesting. Another concern that people are raising with these jobs, this new jobs report that was released shows that the unemployment rate is increasing for Black Americans. In particular, 300,000 Black women just lost their jobs. I believe a big portion of that comes from the cuts from those federal jobs that Donald Trump made, which I tried to warn people about. There's that. There's also the rise of AI that's making people pause. Some of the retail stores near me that I've gone into, I notice I see less sales associates and more self-checkouts. So there's a number of things that are happening where jobs are also being cut. The unemployment rate is continuing to increase, particularly with Black employees. But then also there's the concern of AI. Some of these companies are automating some of the jobs that people used to do. And it makes people wonder what will be our role like in the future if AI continues to increase and the federal government continues to cut jobs. What is going to be our role? And I always pivot back to the states, right? Like, I feel like this is where the states should be able to jump in if they can. Some of those people that had those federal jobs, I would hope that they would be eligible for state jobs, although I know the state can be really tricky with employment. But then also, I think it brings back this question. If the states were to jump in, this is where I would advocate for a public bank, because I feel like a lot of people just don't know that, like North Dakota, for example, they have the Bank of North Dakota, which is a public bank. From what I read, it said that because they had that public bank, that they didn't suffer as badly as other states during the '08 housing crisis. So I wish that more states would push for and advocate for having a public bank, something that can, because what we're seeing, Professor Wolff, is the federal government keeps kicking everything back to the states.
Yeah, I know a great deal. I've studied the Bank of North Dakota. You are quite right. A little history might help people understand it. It's over 100 years old. It was started at the beginning of the 20th century in that state. And the idea was we, the people of North Dakota, which is largely, it's a relatively poor state. It's very agricultural. It doesn't have much industry and so on. It's very cold there in the winter. It's right up against Canada and so forth. They said, we don't want to be a minor issue for some big New York bank or some big California bank. We want to have a bank that is familiar with the conditions here in North Dakota. We want a bank that will help us, understand us, that is part of our community. And so they developed a bank which was owned and operated by the state, not a private bank. So for most of people watching this program, you don't have that where you live. The people of North Dakota, U.S. citizens, just like you and me, they have it. And here's how it works. When they pay taxes to the government, the state government in North Dakota, well, when those taxes are more than what the government needs to keep the roads open and run the schools and all the rest, go back into the general fund. And they go into the bank. That is, if I misspoke. If the bank makes extra money, it gives it to the government because it's part of the government, which means they don't have to raise taxes on their people if the bank is making money, because when the bank makes money, that's profit that flows into the government of North Dakota. And of course, when hard times hit, these are North Dakotans. They're talking to their neighbors who have a mortgage for their home, or they're talking to their local small businesses who have loans at the Bank of North Dakota. So successful has it been that over the last 100+ years of its existence, despite the effort of private big banks in America to get rid of this one example. Let me remind everyone, we have 50 states in the United States. Only one has a public bank. They've kept the others from doing it. But despite Republicans and Democrats who occasionally tried to do what the big banks wanted, up rose the people of North Dakota, businessmen and women, working class people, farmers, and they all said, we want the public bank. And that's why it's there now. Very successful. And it is something missing in other states, which is why there are efforts. I have worked with several of them in many parts of the United States, both at the state level and at the city level, to develop public banks that would be more concerned with maintaining the economic well-being of everyone than in serving just the biggest and richest employers, which is what private banks mostly do. So it is very important to understand that we live in an economic system that puts the priority on private wealth and private enterprise, and believes that this is the royal magical road to prosperity. Well, let me tell you something. It may be for that 20% that we spoke about before, but for the majority of people, it is not working out very well. And that's why we have to say what we have to say about housing, about wages, and we could go on. I have been talking in recent weeks about the inflation that is entering into our food chain. The grocery prices that are already a problem for millions of American families are about to get worse. And that's a result of the tariffs. You know, Mr. Trump talks about the tariffs doing a wonderful thing. Well, let me tell you a little quick story. When I get up in the morning, I do what I think many Americans do. I need a cup of coffee to get going, and I often put either milk or sugar in my coffee. Okay, we don't produce coffee in the United States. Not a significant amount. A little bit in Louisiana, a little bit in Hawaii, but basically the coffee we all drink is imported and is now being subject to a tariff tax, which is going to raise the price of our coffee. Well, I got also more news for you. We don't produce the sugar in sugar, the sugarcane sugar. We import that. So that'll be affected by the tariff, which means the coffee and the sugar that we all, or many of us, start our day with is going to be whacked with increases in prices. You're going to see your local coffee shop, or if you buy your coffee in the coffee bean form, all of these prices are going up. And it's another failure of this economic system. Now a failure added to the housing failure and the wage failure, you're going to get a grocery failure. We are moving as a nation in a direction that is going to make the inadequacy of our economic system issue number one on everyone's mind in a matter now of weeks and months.